Until 1952, it was possible to cross virtually freely between East and West Germany. However, in 1952, in an effort to prevent large-scale migration to the west, the East German authorities erected a barbed wire fence along the inner German border. But Berlin, entirely surrounded in East Germany, was a special case. The British, American and French occupation zones still worked together with the Soviets in the joint administration of the former German capital, and travel between East and West Berlin was largely unrestricted. This was a problem for the Communists because Berlin was the one remaining place where East Germans could cross over to the Free West without problems. 3.5 million people had left East Germany by 1961, which was 20% of the entire population. Many were highly educated and skilled workers. In the first 7 months of 1961 alone, 207,000 people had crossed. On the 13th of August 1961, the Berlin Wall began to be constructed. It was to become a formidable barrier preventing East Germans from escaping west, and increasingly complex in its defences. Travel between East and West Berlin was still required, though through highly regulated checkpoints. Checkpoint Charlie was one of several such crossings. As the name suggests, Charlie is the NATO phonetic for the letter C, and there was also a checkpoint Alpha and checkpoint Bravo. Located at the junction of Friedrichstrasse with Zimmerstrasse and Mauerstrasse, it is important because it was the single crossing point for foreigners and armed forces personnel between East and West. The checkpoint itself on the US side was a simple white wooden shed with a flagpole. On the East German side was the Berlin Wall, a watchtower, zigzag barriers, and later a multi-lane shed to check vehicles and occupants. The Americans deliberately kept Checkpoint Charlie simple because the United States did not consider the crossing to be an international border. US, British and French military personnel had a right to enter East Berlin under the Four Powers Agreement with the Soviet Union, and indeed Soviet troops could enter the Allied sectors of Berlin as well. This was most dramatically shown in October 1961, soon after Checkpoint Charlie was erected. On the 22nd of October, a dispute developed over whether East German guards from the Volkspolizei were allowed to examine the travel documents of a US diplomat who was entering East Berlin to visit the opera. This was at the height of Cold War tensions between President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, and the issue of Western Allied armed forces in Berlin deep behind the Iron Curtain was a troubling one. The Four Powers Agreement of 1945 permitted the personnel of the four occupying powers to move freely over all of Berlin. Stopping the US Chief of Mission to West Berlin was a breach of that rule. When another US diplomat was also stopped and searched, US military police rushed to his assistance. They escorted the diplomatic car into East Berlin, forcing the Volkspolizei to get out of the way. The soldiers then returned to West Berlin. The US military commandant, General Lucius Clay, was furious at East German police behavior. He demanded that the Soviet Union bring the East Germans to heel. But the Soviets backed the East Germans, calling US actions an open provocation. The situation escalated. Another US diplomat was sent to cross on the 27th of October in a diplomatic car. At the same time, US tanks and infantry were dispatched to the nearby Tempelhof airport. Again, the Volkspolizei tried to stop the diplomat, and again US military police escorted his car into East Berlin. But straight afterwards, 33 Soviet T-55 tanks approached the Brandenburg Gate. 10 of these tanks drove on to Friedrichstrasse and stopped 50 meters from Checkpoint Charlie. US tanks appeared and stopped the same distance on the American side. A standoff ensued. Both sides' tanks had loaded their main guns and had orders to fire if they were fired upon. The US government did not want to go to war over West Berlin, and after speaking to the Soviets, Kennedy agreed to go easy over Berlin if the Soviets removed their tanks first. Khrushchev agreed. Kennedy said later, "It's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war." One T-55 withdrew, and a US tank followed suit, until all the tanks had been withdrawn from Checkpoint Charlie. There were several other serious incidents at Checkpoint Charlie during its long history, but none quite as serious as that in 1961. On the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall crossings were opened, and Checkpoint Charlie was finally stood down in October 1990, following German reunification. The actual Checkpoint Charlie shed is now on display at the Allied Museum in Berlin. At the original site is a copy of the guardhouse, which has been put up for tourists. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please do subscribe and also share, and also support me on Patreon. Many thanks.